Hey guys, today's lecture is on the outcomes of the Spanish American War. Yesterday in class or at home, hopefully you completed the discussion board on some of the causes of the Spanish American War. And today we're going to look at how that played out. For all my students who are just virtual only, I want to make sure you see something. The very first link on our unit page says Imperialism Classwork Packet. We've been using this document in class to kind of go over some of the highlights and take notes on imperialism. So if you click on that, it will look like this. It's coming up. Imperialism work packet, and where we're going to go today is it's like the third or fourth page here, the Spanish-American War. So we're going to be on this page in class, discussing this and talking about, taking notes. And if you're at home, you can definitely follow along with what I'm about to do there. Okay, I'm going to switch over to a different version of that. But here we go. The Spanish-American War. Yesterday, you did discussion board on the causes, and many of the causes for the Spanish-American War are very similar to just the causes of imperialism in general. We had economic reasons for going to war with Spain. We had competitive world power military defense reasons for going to war with Spain. A couple that are highlighted on this sheet is yellow journalism. The media really pushed America into war. Just because it was interesting and it was a way for newspapers to sell newspapers. And so the media was very much a part of pushing America into war with Spain. Also, there was a U.S. naval ship, the USS Maine, that was sunk in Havana Harbor, right off the shores of Cuba, and Americans did lose their lives. And while this turned out to just be an accidental explosion, many people in 1898 said that the death of American sailors and the loss of American property justified going to war. So I do want to highlight those two causes of the Spanish-American War really quick. But what we're going to look at today is, so what comes out of this war? Many students have never heard of the Spanish-American War. Many students don't know what it was about. And many students don't know how important it is on the backside in terms of what America gains. The Spanish-American War was a very short war. It was in the summer of 1898. It was 90 days, roughly. And Secretary of State John Hay called it a splendid little war, those are interesting adjectives to use to describe war. Splendid little war. War is not good. War is hell. People are losing their lives. There's violence. There's combat. However, the reason he calls it that, a splendid little war, is because America benefited so much from what we got out of it. We went to war with Spain because Spain was a declining imperial power, and they were losing control of their colonies. And in fact, they were mistreating some of their colonies. And America stepped in there to help and to liberate some of those colonies. But in fact, what we are going to end up doing is essentially just taking over those colonies. So let's look at what happens. I'm going to scroll down here to the bottom. Spain essentially had four colonies that we are interested in: Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. And at the end of the Spanish-American War, the final treaty is called the Treaty of Paris. Very clever name. Treaty of Paris, 1898. America gets control of all four of those former Spanish colonies in some way, shape, or form. The first is Cuba. Cuba was the most mistreated. The Spanish government was doing concentration camps and was mistreating the Cuban people. The Cubans were actually fighting their own war, their own insurrection to throw off their Spanish colonizers. And part of why America went to war was to help those Cuban rebels. Here's the catch, though. Before the Spanish-American War, we told the Cubans that we would liberate them from Spain and they would be free to control themselves. This is what's called the Teller Amendment to our declaration of war. In the Teller Amendment, we tell Cuba that be allowed to control their own destiny, that they will be free. I'll scroll up here and show you. This is what the Teller Amendment said, that the people of the island of Cuba are and of right ought to be free, and that the U.S. disclaims any disposition or control over said island. And when this is all over, when it's accomplished, to leave the government and control of the island to its people. So let's just highlight some of that. The island of Cuba is free. The U.S. disclaims any disposition to control, and that they're going to leave the government to control its own people. That was what the Teller Amendment said. However, I'm going to come back down here. After the war, we don't necessarily keep that promise. After the war, we make Cuba a protectorate, which meant that we are now going to have some control over them. We say, yeah, Cuba, form your own constitution, become an independent country, but we're going to control some of your decisions, and you're going to give us a military base. This was what was called the Platt Amendment to the Cuban Constitution, and that's right up here as well. I'm going to keep my highlighter on. We said things like, the government of Cuba shall never enter a treaty that we don't like. The government shall not assume or contract any public debt. The government of Cuba consents that the U.S. may exercise the right to intervene. These amendments to the Cuban Constitution don't sound like Cuba is actually free and controlling their own destiny. We are exercising some control over them. And then it also mentions this military base. You guys probably know and have heard some of the controversies around Guantanamo Bay. But Guantanamo Bay is a military base, a U.S. military base on the island of Cuba that we will have control of for the 20th century and beyond. And we'll cover more with that later. Okay, so that's the story of Cuba. We do liberate Cuba from Spain, but we essentially make them a U.S. protectorate. What about Puerto Rico and Guam? Puerto Rico and Guam were also Spanish colonies, and they become American territories through the Treaty of Paris. We still have these territories today. Puerto Rico and Guam are still part of the United States. Citizens of these territories are given some rights, but not full U.S. citizenship rights. And there's much talk about, will those territories at some point become a 51st or a 52nd state? Will they get full rights, or are they going to stay in this kind of territorial status? But to this day, the United States still owns Puerto Rico and Guam. And we got those from the Spanish-American War. Lastly, the Philippine Islands. The Philippine Islands were also Spanish colonies that became U.S. territories. However, the Filipino people were not as accepting of this new arrangement. We do not still own the Philippines. We will actually grant the Philippines their independence after World War II in 1945. But what's really controversial is right from the get-go in 1899, the Philippine people did not want to be a U.S. territory. Let's see if I can scroll down here. The last question on this note sheet says, why was the acquisition of the Philippine Islands so controversial? Filipino rebels, they were led by this guy, Emiliano Aguinaldo. They had been our allies when we fought against Spain. When we were fighting against Spain, the Filipinos were on our side. However, now they turned against us because America did not grant them their freedom. We never made the Philippines a promise like we made Cuba. And so when the Spanish-American War was over, we tried to treat the Philippines just like Puerto Rico and Guam, but they fought back. And this starts what's called the American-Filipino War. It lasts until 1902, and this war was much costlier and controversial than the Spanish-American War. If we call the Spanish-American War the Splendid Little War, we would not use that terminology for the American-Filipino War. There were many people in America, the Anti-Imperialist League, who said our treatment of the Philippines was unjust. We very bloodily suppressed this Filipino rebellion. We used torture tactics like waterboarding to bring the Philippine Islands into submission. And we essentially forced the Philippines to be an American territory for the next 40 plus years. The American-Filipino War was also much costlier in terms of money and American lives. Nevertheless, the Spanish-American War definitely changes the landscape of America on the world. Now, instead of being a Western Hemisphere local power, we are becoming a global power. And that's the big idea. America will now have territories and possessions all around the globe, both in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and also out in the Southeast Asia and Pacific, the Philippines and Guam. Okay, that's it. That's the outcomes of the Spanish-American War. Please let me know if you have any questions in the question box at the end of this video. Thanks.